Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the conversation. This is Anshu. I'm the co-founder and CEO here at Lynch. I'd like to tell you about the conversation we're going to be having today, as well as kick off the session itself. So just to maybe start with a little bit of personal logistics, my connectivity and the internet in the area that I'm at unfortunately failed this morning. So I'm trying to work on a low bandwidth kind of situation. Hopefully I'm audible and clear, but that's why my video will be kind of hard to toggle on and off today. For meeting logistics, as you saw, you're all muted at this point. We will be recording the session and sharing the recordings afterwards with everyone, as well as a synthesis of some of the meeting findings. Those will be coming in the next couple of days. But we do encourage you to very actively participate using the chat and the Q&A functions to allow us to kind of hear your thoughts and your ideas, as well as any questions if we don't get a chance to follow up in the Q&A part of this session today, we'll follow up in the materials and some of the subsequent sharing that we'll do of the recording post today's session. So with that, I'd like to just kind of start with a quick update on Leaf and some of the things that we've been up to. As many of you know, we've been introducing in a new way to plan and schedule transportation between shippers, carriers, and 3PLs. Leaf Flex Dedicated has been out in the market now for over 18 months, and we've started to see really good results. But you know, in particular, over the last few months, when a lot of stuff has been very, very challenging for our customers to manage, Leaf Flex Dedicated solutions have performed really, very resiliently. Some of the shippers we've been working with, we're sharing an example here, have been able to, on the Leaf Flex Dedicated portion of the freight that they're managing, get 100% tender acceptance, 100% rate compliance for all of us practitioners in the industry. That's pretty hard to do in normal times. It's certainly been special to do that in this pandemic time. But with that reliability that the shippers have benefited from, their providers have also been able to gain efficiencies. And as a consequence, the Flex Dedicated managed portion of freight has been coming in significantly under budget. But very interestingly, in this period of extreme volatility, without Leaf, the stuff that's not managed through those green blocks of contracts has seen less than 60% tender acceptance in the same lane. Sometimes we're talking about the same provider, the same carrier that is being asked to provide service, but without a plan and a schedule, they're just not able to execute with the same reliability. And as a consequence, the non-lease managed volume has been significantly above budget. So that's given us a lot of confidence, not just to continue the work that we're doing on the Flex Dedicated, but for our customers to continue to expand how Flex Dedicated is used in their portfolios. With that planning and scheduling, we've been able to coordinate across shippers. And that is part of why we're here, right? To unlock these unprecedented efficiencies that can only be identified and executed at a network level. So having a network-wide view has been really interesting to sort of see how that plays in the market, even in, again, these very, very unusual times. For example, with one customer where we've identified for them 32 internal network moves, round trips that they can create where freight actually goes from facility A to facility B, and then there's other freight that goes from B back to A. There's a handful of those moves that are possible for them internally within their network, but of course the number of such opportunities expands dramatically as they start looking externally, using some of the volumes on the platform at least. We're talking about thousands of round trip opportunities and circuits where there's maybe more than just out and back, there may be 2 or 3 legs that can be combined together with other freight to generate those significant efficiencies. Where, for example, in the 3-legged circuit that we're describing, it's a full day's worth of driving for the carrier, and they're able to, instead of being reactive to what tenders they might get on one lane versus another lane. They're able to fully utilize that truck and driver for a full day each time, generating not just savings against the theoretically best possible rate that could have been achieved, but in actual fact, as volume again that isn't being managed with the flex dedicated network coordinated way that Leaf is helping with, that actual data shows a pretty significant 25% increase in cost, right? So creating these efficiencies is benefiting not just the shipper, but also the carrier to run a much more reliable and predictable service. But as we continue to do this work, we continue to need more and more data to provide more and more of an automated solution back to our customers. So with some of our lighthouse shipper customers, the example you're seeing here illustrates the way we are starting to now work with them, where we're looking at the full portfolio of their transportation decisions, where they might rightly be buying some of the freight that they need to procure in the spot market, and they're doing that very deliberately, and other parts of their portfolio are being bought through their TMS routing guide and their waterfall. As Leaf Flex Dedicated it becomes a part of their portfolio, the need to optimize across all of these interrelated solutions and to do that continuously relies on a bunch of data. So as we integrate in actuals data and in some cases forecast and order data, we're able to help our customers optimize these decisions, not just once a quarter or once a year, but every week if they'd like. And just one example, when we worked on this in this algorithmic way with one customer to look at their data for a full year, for the first 6 months, we used the actual patterns in their data to train the algorithms. And then for the balance of the year, we used that trained algorithm to optimize decisions weekly. The difference between what they did pay in that year versus what they could have paid was 10%. And for all of us who've been in the industry to know that structurally managing things differently so that it's automated and requires a lot fewer people to go touch the decisions on a day-to-day basis is significant and important. A 10% productivity improvement is just really hard to, first of all, even identify, but then secondly, to execute. And we're on our way to automating it. So we're very excited about this area of development on the Leaf platform and this expanded way that we're working with our customers. But as we've kind of stepped through this journey over the last couple, 3 years, what we've continuously come back to is the kinds of problems we're solving for our customers and the kinds of innovations that we're introducing in, and being able to tell the difference between what is an incremental improvement and what is a breakthrough innovation. And so that kind of sets the stage for today's conversation. We've got a great panel of experts in today's Q&A as well as in our conversation to talk through their perspectives on what makes for breakthrough automation. And as we get into that discussion, I just want to briefly introduce 3 panelists. So first we have Brian Aoaeh, who I've gotten to know over the last few years. Brian is really a student of the supply chain, a deep expert in the space. I am amongst many, many folks who consider him an expert that I can bounce these kinds of questions off of in terms of, is this a $5 idea or a $50,000 idea, Brian? And Brian always helps to kind of cut through the noise. In his spare time, to the extent that he could find any, he's helped to create the New York Supply Chain Forum and now a set of chapters of supply chain meetups that extend across the world. He's an adjunct professor at the at NYU, talking about supply chain and other topics, and an investor at REFASHIOND Ventures. So Brian, bringing all those different perspectives to bear, really looking forward to his contributions to this conversation. Eric and I have gotten to know each other over the last few years. Eric, as many of you probably know well, is the lead reporter at the Journal of Commerce when it comes to technology and logistics, and when those two topics overlap, and being able to tell, signal from noise and help to kind of guide through all of us who are trying to bring in effect sort of transformational change in logistics. So Eric is a real thought leader in the space and someone who's who's been a great sounding board, as has, of course, Mike Maples and the Floodgate team, who've been partners with us now for the last few years. In all of our conversations, kind of learning by analogy from all the different businesses that Mike has been involved with. He's always a very clear guide in terms of being, asking great questions to really help us stay focused on the things that matter the most. And so with these expert panelists, I'm going to turn this over to Greer Lynch from Leaf. Greer has very recently joined the Leaf team, and she comes from a 15-year background in technology and marketing. She's had roles at Apple and at Microsoft, but she's also an experienced entrepreneur who co-founded a startup and worked on marketing for the startup. So she's lived the startup journey as well. And most recently, she was responsible for partnership marketing at Convoy. So she's also lived in the transportation world. So finding all those different backgrounds was really a plus for us at Leaf. And I'm really excited to have Greer kind of lead this conversation with our panel. So over to you, Greer.
Thanks, Anshu. Welcome, everyone. Excited to jump into the breakthrough automation discussion with our great group of panelists here. But I just want to set a little context for this conversation. So just to start, there's a famous anecdote used in product development circles, and it essentially goes like this. If Henry Ford had asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse, right? And if he'd listened, he would never have created the Model T. So with that story, whether it's an urban legend or it has a grain of truth to it, it certainly brings up an interesting concept to think about. And specifically for this conversation, what are the differences between automation that simply makes things go faster versus an automation that radically changes traditional processes? By definition, we at Leaf believe that automation that makes existing processes not just faster, but instead radically improves practices should be classified as breakthrough automation. Our vision is to bring this breakthrough automation products that radically change the way transportation is planned, bought, and sold, as Anshu just spoke about. Our team recently had a company offsite where we talked about the critical challenges that the transportation industry faces. Mark Shaughnessy, who previously ran procurement for Coca-Cola North America, participated in our conversation. And one of the things that he told us and stuck out was his commentary about how the current economic state has challenged the very traditional processes. For example, the yearly RFP award. So right now that process is simply irrelevant, as it's really impossible to plan a year out under the current volatile market conditions. So how should companies adapt, and how should we think about this for 2021 and beyond? One answer is to leverage technology to help the industry make faster and smarter decisions. In the RFP example, what's the value of a platform that can help you make on-the-fly decisions about transportation spend and manage that spend, but with both precision and minimal overhead? So to make it really easy to adopt these technologies. Using technology is not just, in this example, about providing better insight and guidance into decision-making, but also that automation about the processes. So that's the backdrop for this conversation. And I'm going to open up to our panelists with some questions we have. And as you have questions from the audience, please add them in our window. We'll get to them at the end of the end of the session. And for any that we don't get to, don't worry, we'll follow up in email after the event. Great. So as I mentioned, we all know we're in a very volatile economic period by all accounts, right? If you believe the predictions from many leading economists, this is going to continue at least a year, probably longer. Given this context, for the panelists here, how would you define breakthrough automation? And what do you see as the top industry challenges that those in the transportation space can look to breakthrough automation to solve? So I guess I can hand that over to Mike to start.
Okay.
How would you?
I'll give it a shot, and thanks for having me. And I'll lend whatever insights I can, but I should warn people that as I'm an investor who invests in things too early, way too early, or sometimes even legally ambiguously too early. And so I'm not always the best suited to say exactly how to go from point A to point B. It's more like my job's to identify something interesting and hope that that's correct. So the way I think of breakthroughs just in general is that most people live in the present, and most people, when they think about the future, think that it will be a projection of the present going forward. So they think that the future will mostly look like today, only more so. So the future is more better version of today. And to me, a breakthrough, by definition, has to break free from something. So it has to break free from the present. And a person who thinks about breakthroughs believes that by definition, the future will be different in unexpected and surprising and hopefully better ways. And so if we want to, and since the future is not like the weather, it doesn't happen to us, it happens because of us. Some people in society decide they want to be part of breakthroughs. Startups create breakthrough ideas, but actually the future is co-created with the startup and their early customers who want to make those breakthroughs become true. And so if I think about breakthrough automation, maybe by way of analogy, one of the companies that we invested in was Lyft back in the day. And Lyft was not just a better version of taxis. So if you wanted to have as many cars and riders on a transportation network as Lyft now has, you'd have to hire like thousands upon thousands of dispatchers, because you'd have to handle the calls coming in and match it to the drivers out there on the road. And so whereas with Lyft, automation allows you to connect riders and drivers algorithmically. And so what drives my enthusiasm about Leaf and approaches like it is that we're not saying more better brokers is the solution, or make brokers go faster all the time is the solution. Instead, what you could imagine is a future where you have software-defined networks that are driven not just by throwing more people at the problem, but by algorithms, which make predictions more accurate, which make transportation networks more nimble. And I think this is increasingly important, anti-fragile to the conditions of the pandemic. So like if you look at, there's a difference between resilient and anti-fragile. Resilient is I can handle and adjust to problems that come my way. Anti-fragile, it'd be like a box that says, shake me as hard as you want, bring it on. And so you kind of want, ideally at the limit, you want transportation networks and logistics supply chains that are where the company that has an agile anti-fragile network actually benefits from chaotic conditions at the expense of the competition, rather than merely thinks about offense versus defense. So I'll stop there for now.
That's great. And I especially like your point about it being a partnership between the startup and their customers and kind of a journey together. Great. I hand it over to Brian or Eric. Do you have any, could you share with us how you define breakthrough automation? Anything to add?
Brian, go ahead.
No, I think I'll let Eric go first.
Okay. So let me think. I plan to say one thing, but let me start with another, because I was moderating a session this morning, the World Economic Forum. Nothing to do with trucking. It was about actually the future of kind of manufacturing and in a more sustainable way. And there was a guy on there who spoke a lot about how his company was reimagining how production of products that are primarily made via petrochemicals could be undertaken. So using different means to create the ingredients that go into products that have relied on petrochemicals, so that you're not relying on a multi-billion-dollar factory next to an oil refinery, right? And obviously that lesson can't be drawn into every single other industry, especially like an intangible industry like logistics. But it did get me thinking that you need to have a mindset in terms of breakthrough automation where you're able to step completely outside of what your brain orients around a situation, right? And I mean, this is basically a different version of what Mike was saying, but some people are equipped to do that and some people are not, but I think more people are going to have to think about that because the cycles seem to be going faster and faster in terms of what that reshaping of what traditional processes or everything from procuring freight to making a petrochemical product. So what I was going to start off by saying was, I think the biggest breakthrough in automation that I see, or I guess we're supposed to say, how do we define it? It's really hard to say what it means to such a varied group of people as exists in even trucking logistics, right? So I think the most interesting thing for me is to see the building blocks and the foundation start to emerge that enables technologies like Leaf and others to really shine through. And by that, I mean, and this is technology that both Brian and I have written about, but something as simple as like a basic operating system that small carriers can use that's common across a range of independent trucking companies that creates some sort of standardization for their operations and the milestone data that they give and the way they procure and the way they run their businesses. That's a breakthrough in terms of being able to leverage technology that, Leaf customers depend on, and whatever the next, new innovation on kind of procurement optimization is. So that kind of stuff for me is like the building blocks are almost, I tend to be a little more pragmatic probably than a VC investor does. I'm thinking about the next 5 minutes rather than 10 years down the road. And so, those building blocks to me are the things that are really fascinating to see, because these are not theoretical exercises. These things are actually out in the wild right now.
Okay, I'll jump in now. So I think, like Mike, I was at KEC Ventures for 10 years. I'm building a brand new fund. So I tend to live 10, 20 years in the future. But then like Eric, I've also been writing for Freight Waves for, the past year or more. So I'm trying to be a bit more pragmatic so that folks in the industry don't write me off as a complete nut, as a complete nut job. But then I'm also teaching at NYU. I taught there last semester, the spring semester, which was a baptism by fire. And so they are trusting me to sort of educate people who might someday be in chief supply chain officer roles, chief operating officer roles, and that sort of thing. So I think I have a different perspective. So in thinking about this topic and in listening to Anshu give, the state of Leaf, the state of the union, so to speak, a few things stuck out to me. So one is thinking about supply chains in terms of networks, in terms of platforms, and in terms of ecosystems. I think that's one. The other is, and I'm remembering the slide that talked about less than 60% tender acceptances, which also means more than 40% tender rejections, right? And so technologies that help this ecosystem solve that problem and become a little more productive. And Anshu actually used the word, and I was like, man, he's stealing my thunder. But the economic productivity of a company and the industry as a whole, I would think that a breakthrough technology one has to do the thing that Mike described, which is really change the state of the world when we think about what it might be like in 20 years. But at the same time, like Eric was saying, it also has to solve a fundamental problem that these enterprises are facing right now in a way that can be implemented, in a way that's not too difficult to adopt. And I think if you can do those two things, then at least to my mind, you have the makings of a breakthrough technology on your hands, or a breakthrough automation on your hands.
Mm. Well, so we talked about defining this, and I think for like thinking about how this could be practically implemented, you know, procurement and operation leaders are often inundated with the newest, bright, shiny object ahead of them, and they think, you know, people are telling them it's the panacea for all their problems. And I think you have a lot of people throughout the organization who just see all these come across their desk. So how should transportation executives kind of cut through the noise and determine which of these solutions aren't just bright and shiny, but they actually could make these radical improvements to their organization? How should those executives or, you know, folks throughout the organization think about that as they evaluate new technologies and solutions? Brian, would you be able to answer that one?
I'll tackle that one first. So the first answer I'll give is probably not very practical, but it's still one that I think executives at companies need to consider. One thing we noticed, my co-founder Lisa and I, when we were, you know, in talking to executives about what's happening in the fashion and apparel supply chain market or space, is, you know, companies will have innovation teams, but then the folks on the innovation teams don't last long on the innovation teams, right? There's a 3-year promotion cycle, there's a 2-year promotion cycle. So someone is there and then they move on and then there's someone else. But, you know, the undercurrent to the exchange we had just before is about how some of these things take a long time to unfold, right? It can be 10 years, it can be 20 years. Even if it's 5 years, that's still relatively a long time if the promotions cycles are like 2 years and whatnot. So I think the companies that are serious about innovation as a core piece of their strategy have to rethink how at least the innovation side of their business, how that side works. Because I think what you need is a core group of people who are working on innovation as it relates to the company's strategy, who are there for a long time, right? So that they understand the industry, the trends in the industry, they understand the specific company, they understand what's happening in its supply chain network, and then they can marry that to what's happening on the outside and decide what should be brought in. The other thing that I'd suggest, which is more practical and which when people think about this in hindsight will seem completely self-serving, will seem completely self-serving, is if I were doing this at a company, I would outsource some aspects of the work, right? So I would team up with venture capitalists, I team up with management consultants, I team up with folks who have a skill set that, like Mike described, is about living far out in the future and trying to figure out what's coming next and why it might work. While I, in my job as an innovation person at a company, focus more closely on the near term, right? So what do we need in the next 5 years for our company? And then the thing that I try to do is how do I marry these two things for the benefit of the company? Hopefully that's helpful. I'll pause and let someone else build on that.
Yeah, I mean, Eric, could you comment on the bright shiny objects idea? Like, without giving a product endorsement of any particular, what characteristics should shippers and carriers look for in true breakthrough automation ideas? And like, what do they need to think about in order to tell the difference between the two?
I might mute myself first. Yeah. Let me just follow up quickly on something that Brian was talking about. I think this is a critical thing, and this is obviously, it'll be self-serving for me because part of what I feel my role is to help people make those types of decisions about what has traction, what is valuable, what is less valuable, what is a bright shiny object. I think there was a sense at some point that emerged. This might have been like a Gartner supply chain kind of idea that I think was very useful, in that you needed to have a team that was operations based, and then you needed a team that kind of sat parallel to them that was sort of consistently focusing on innovation. The problem, I think, with that approach is if you're not involved innately with operations every day, you can lose sight of what the actual problem is. So you can't just be purely in some stream of innovation, ingestion into your company without it being tethered to the realities of what's going on. But the problem then is, how do you divvy up that time of actually running operations versus studying what's in the market and studying how it works? It's a problem, and it's different for every company. And for some companies, it will be totally manageable to have a team that can dance in and out of both of those worlds. Other companies should outsource it to a consultant or to Brian. Brian doesn't have enough to do during the day. So, so to your point about shiny objects, so I'm going to say something a little maybe provocative, hopefully not too provocative, but I kind of think that almost everything to a certain extent today is a little bit of a shiny object, because companies that have come on the scene in the last 5 years are infinitely better at marketing themselves than companies that came along 10, 15 years ago. They have more channels to do so. They're more adept at doing so. A technology company in logistics that came along 15 years ago might have a very successful organization and be like the tree that fell in the woods that no one heard, because they just didn't even think about building in like a marketing component to it. So to a certain extent, almost every company I come across is brighter and shinier than they actually are at the beginning. So that's just something that you, as a potential buyer or user of a software in the market, just need to understand, and that's fine. If your ear or your eye is caught by a certain software, reach out, try it. It's almost better if you're proactive about this than if you're waiting for inbound emails or cold calls about it, because you'll be on the sort of the offensive about what it can do and what problem it's solving for you. So, and I think that the good thing about that is that software now is easier to dance in and out of as well. It's not easy, but it's easier. You're not committing, to a license over a number of years. A lot of times you can get a really short-term kind of pilot or trial. So those types of exploratory initiatives are easier to undertake. I just think, I think from a separating a shiny object to real like value driver, you need the sort of traditional things, get references, live in the system for a few days. Does it solve a problem? If it does, who cares if the logos on their website are not so impressive? Like, is it solving your problem? Are they helping with your, some sort of connectivity between two systems or data that is a mess? It's almost like you need to think about these as like microservices, right? Like, just use it to its best advantage and then grow from there.
Great, thank you. But sorry.
Oh, I guess the only thing I would add in some of this, and we've kind of been alluding to it, but I like to say that it's not enough to just know what a different future could be, because in the end, ideas that spread win, and ideas that don't spread don't matter. They just sit in the mind of the person having the idea. And so, like, ultimately creating a different future involves a couple things. One is the recognition that we can create one. Not everybody believes that. Some people just go with the flow and do the best they can and make the most they can out of the system that they live in. And they just deal with the world that's given to them and just accept it. So the first thing is just acknowledge that the future can be different. We can decide to make it different. And then I think the second thing is to identify a different potential future. But the third thing is, therefore, we have to move people to that future.
Yes.
And in order to do that, it's not enough to just propose potential wacky future ideas. It's like, what we have to do is we have to connect that future idea specifically, tangibly, in a set of well-defined steps back to the present.
Yes.
And then with those people living in the present, hold out our hands and move them on the first step to that different future. Yes. Because otherwise it doesn't count.
Yes.
And so, like, that's what co-creating the future means, is moving people, because people are, even if they're experiencing pain, they can be comfortable in their present state of pain because they're used to it. And so we have to convince them that the alternative of a different future justifies getting out of their comfort zone and taking a different next step than they normally would have on the path to taking a whole bunch of different next steps. But it's, you know, it's hard, but it's worth it. But it's still incumbent on anybody living in the future who wants to make that true, to not just stop there, but to come back to the present and help lead people down a set of credible steps.
If you've been hammering your thumb for 5 minutes, it doesn't really hurt to hammer your thumb anymore, right? So.
All right.
So Mike, this connects nicely to your concept then of backcasting, which I'm not sure everyone attending today is familiar with. Can you kind of explain that? I mean, you sort of just did, but define what backcasting is, and in the context of the transportation industry, like what can we learn from that process that will help us find the next exponentially better technology?
Yeah, well, for the most part, most people are living in the present, and actually most things that people are doing are projection of the present, and that's probably okay 99% of the time. Like, it's okay, I don't need to have a breakthrough in how I brush my teeth, right? It kind of works good enough right now. Maybe somebody will come up with a breakthrough, but it hasn't been a burning pain. But there are some situations where you don't want the future to be an extension forward from the present, and so most people living in the present, they try to predict the future by forecasting, which is projecting forward from what's happening. But if you want a different future, by definition, it has to be different. So you go out, you get out of the present, and you explore different potential futures enabled by usually technology breakthroughs. And then I call it backcasting because you're in the future, you work backwards to the present. So rather than project forward the steps into the future, you get out of the present, you move into the future, and then you say, okay, is this a vision or is this a hallucination? Well, it's a vision if you can explicitly connect that future that you want to design in a sequence of steps back to the present, and that then you can move people. So backcasting is finding the different future and then meeting people where they live and then moving them on a new set of steps towards that different future of your design. So that's kind of what it's really about. And you know, it works better in situations where the forecasting works 99% of the time for 99% of things. But the problem is it takes the baggage of yesterday forward with you. And so in situations where you don't want to do that, you want to backcast, not forecast.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you.
Can I add to the backcasting discussion, because I think given the audience, we want to try to make this as practical and as tangible as possible. And I think, you know, the preview that Anshu gave is really helpful, because, you know, you can think about the current state of the world. How does Leaf solve problems for its members in the current state of the world, right? So one member, let's think about one member, they have their logistics operations, they engage with Leaf, and that's, you know, that's great. Leaf is creating all these cost savings, is enabling all these cost savings for them. But in the future, as the system becomes more robust, as different members build more confidence in the stability of the system as something that they can rely on, right? We want to get to a point where there's a network and there's an ecosystem that is powered and driven by Leaf, right? Because if you're using Leaf just for your own thing, there's only so far that the benefits will take you. Whereas if everyone is using the Leaf platform to manage some portion or even all of their logistics operations, the benefit is that much greater. And I think that's where the forecasting and the backcasting discussion can come in. So forecasting is, you know, one company is thinking about where can Leaf take us if we were the only ones that use this for what we do. And then the backcasting as well, what if we start in a future where this is an ecosystem, it's a platform, and we're tied in on Leaf with all the other members? What does that look like? And there's a point that I think can be made to tie, between what Eric said about shiny objects and startups in the present day doing a much better job of marketing, and what Mike said about, you have to bring people along with you. There tends to be situations where technologists think that marketing and PR is a waste of time, when you're not going to be able to bring people into the future if you don't tell them what that future is going to look like and how you're going to get there. And so marketing is just as important as actually building the technology.
Yeah, Greer, actually, I'm sorry, I know you wanted to move on, but I wanted
No,
to pick up on that because, as Anshu was talking about kind of uptake and benefits, it dawned on me that this resembled a conversation that we had at an event of ours. This would have been 18 months ago now, where we had, this was on ocean freight allocation. So we're not talking about trucking, but we had Walmart and we had Expeditors and we had CMA, CGM, three large, obviously, companies in their various fields, talking about forecast allocations. So basically 8 weeks out, how many containers do I think of capacity do I think I need on a vessel as Walmart, and the capability that they had sort of jointly built around that. And I got to thinking during the session, it wasn't just about what Walmart enabled for itself and other customers of Expeditors that may have used the similar system. It was, well, think of the knock-on effects for CMA CGM, the vessel operator. If X% of their customers are using a really sophisticated, advanced system to forecast when containers are actually going to show up, the other customers of theirs are also going to benefit because CMA has better certainty about the remainder of its. So there's all sorts of things that, you reach. It's like, since herd immunity is on our minds right now, it's almost like technology herd immunity, right? Like everybody benefits from the use of technology by a certain percentage of users, right? So I just wanted to throw that kind of anecdote in as well.
Great, thank you. I think, Brian, you write a lot about different technologies that help the supply chains advance, like from AI helping with fleet operations to tech ensuring against spoilage and reefers. So specifically in supply chain, what do you think it takes for an organization to adapt to a new breakthrough solution? And do you have any examples you could share?
I'd be lying if I said that I have any concrete examples, because I haven't worked in any of these large companies to do this. But hopefully, maybe I'll say something to pretend I know what I'm talking about. Then Eric can give some more concrete examples. But I think the notion of, and VCs do this all the time, but understanding that experiments are really important, and Eric touched on this, right? So doing pilots, doing proofs of concept, figuring out how to ensure that during the pilot and the proof of concept, the trial, that the company really does a good job of figuring out if an innovation is going to work or not. And then based on the outcome of that, that engagement, deciding if this is something the company should deploy further within its operations, or if it's something that is not worth pursuing anymore. I'd say that's the one thing that I think executives who are thinking about these issues should keep in mind. And one reason to outsource some of the work is, I think the folks within the company who are working on innovation and technology-driven innovation in relation to their company's operations, I think what they really need to get at is building the relationships within the company, so that when these trials, when they identify something that they want to try out, it's a meaningful experiment, right? Too often, the complaint that startups have is, oh, these big companies, they sign up for pilots and POCs, and it never goes anywhere, right? To them, the pilot or the POC is a rounding error. I think companies who continue to have that attitude will lose out to the companies that do the real work of figuring out what can be transformative, and what is not. And that's another argument for outsourcing the figure out what's meaningful and what's not among the shiny things, and then have the executives actually engage in doing trials and proofs of concept.
I think you've also got to, I think, as a potential user of software, when someone starts talking about automation, back to kind of the overarching theme today, you need to press them on what that means.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Like, and you have to have if you're in a logistics role and you don't know, you can't tell whether the person sitting in front of you is telling you something that's real or, fantasy. You need to have someone in an IT function who can whisper in your ear, this is nothing, right? It's marketing. So, I mean, I would say 9 out of 10 conversations I have either start with or evolve into, and then we're going to automate this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I get around, a lot of times I don't even ask, but when I do get around to asking what that means, it's a much more rich discussion. Yeah. And also it's very evident whether they're actually doing something different or not. So just have that basic discussion. Don't be afraid to ask what seems to be like a stupid question, because I'll be honest, like not that many people, including me, really understand what automation is. So, and especially what the difference between like effective automation and just ineffective automation. So.
That's really helpful. Yeah. Mike, from your perspective, what as like a builder and a product visionary do you do to make sure that you're working on something that's uniquely different and impactful and going to actually, make that meaningful automation happen?
Yeah, well, the two thought experiments I like to run, I mean, from a meta level, I like to ask what I call the why now question. So, I believe that I often like to say all of it will happen. The question is just when. And so is now the time. And so and what I find is that the why now is usually driven by what I like to call inflections. And inflections are the stuff that's happening that's even bigger than you. It's kind of like waves in the ocean for a surfer. It's the things that allow us to change the subject about what the future might be. And so technology inflections are things like Moore's law and the collapsing costs of AI as a commodity and those kinds of things. It usually has to do with technology price performance. It's an exponential curve. Yeah. And then you have adoption inflections, like smartphones went from 10% adoption in 2009 to more than 50% by 2014. And a why now usually combines them in a clever way. So like back to the Lyft example, GPS locators got accurate enough in smartphones and the iPhone 3GS to locate riders and drivers on a map. And then you could envision a world where most people had smartphones. And so you could say, I could see a world where you'd have a network of riders and drivers, they'd have smartphones, you could locate them. You could do this in the future. You couldn't have done it before. And so that's what I always look for is what are the converging change events, improvement curves that are creating the opportunity for us to do things that we haven't been able to do in the past. And a startup ought to be able to answer that if they're going to earn the confidence of the innovative customer, because the innovative customer has to believe that you can deliver and not just hand wave. And why now is a really good heuristic, I find, to see if that's the case.
Yep.
Great. Then shifting specifically to this industry, maybe Eric or Brian, can you give an example of something that's happened within the industry in the past decade or so where that a breakthrough automation technology has impacted, maybe intermodal or something along those lines?
That's a question for Eric.
Yeah. Right.
So,
Put you on the spot.
okay, this is gonna probably sound very insulting in a lot of ways, but just I would say the biggest development in terms of automation in the last decade has been just lack of resistance finally to internet based systems and cloud based systems. I mean, really, it sounds really basic again, but 15 years ago, I was writing about portals where companies could make online bookings as revolutionary. And now it's, the fact that that's just gospel and not like, well, I still kind of like doing it this other way is sort of the biggest mindset hurdle that's been passed, right? So, I mean, there is no shortage of interesting and amazing technologies in the market. All you have to do is basically open your eyes and turn your computer on or your smartphone, and you will fall in any direction into an interesting company. But that recognition that those systems built on those kind of underlying technologies were safe and more efficient and less costly is probably the biggest development of the past decade. And then, so that industry lag, I'm putting this in the framework of what Mike, I'm like taking notes of what Mike is saying because it's so interesting. Putting it in that framework, what's the next kind of state of the industry like 5 years from now, work backward from there, recognizing that the industry doesn't have an aversion to technology, but there's a lag to what it adopts versus maybe some other industries. It's really hard. I don't really have any magical answers, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it comes down. Go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead, Greer.
No, I was just going to say, I think it comes down to people being comfortable in their pain, right? And how do you move from it's working well enough to really getting them the motivation to change and to adopt some new technology, new process.
Yeah, I was going to add, when I first met Anshu, it was right around when, so I was still at KEC Ventures, and Anshu was starting to talk to investors about what Leaf is doing and starting to raise around. And, to give you some insights into why we didn't invest, or at least one reason why we didn't invest, I didn't succeed in persuading the rest of the team. But the conversation was really the why now question. So KEC Ventures has, had a lot of in-house knowledge about financial markets and that sort of thing, fintech technology. And so, we had gone through the same debate with freight waves, and the thing was, it's very difficult to get any market, let alone a market as conservative as freight and logistics, to adopt new types of financial instruments. And just talking about the way this was going to be done, the idea eventually is to automate all this. And does the technology, do the enabling technologies even exist to make it happen? Was a point of debate. And the argument I made, going to Mike's point about backcasting, is, if we were in the year 2000 and we were forecasting this, maybe I would say you're right, because at that point I wouldn't have had the sort of understanding of where things are going. But now, if we look at IoT technology, if we look at the advances in AI, if we look at the advances in cloud computing and how quickly the costs have come down, if we look at edge computing and whatnot, we understand that the enabling technologies are much cheaper and much more accessible and much more reliable, right? Connectivity is much improved than where it was. And so if you think about where things are heading, it makes complete sense that this is possible. Now, then the question becomes, are there people who can paint this vision that brings the industry along to adopt this technology, first incrementally, and then in a wave that makes this a big thing? And so the point I made with Leaf is that yes, I think that Anshu and the team he has can do that. And the other team that we were talking about was Craig at Freight Waves, right? And I said I think Craig has the same sort of characteristics. Now, with any venture investment, success is not guaranteed, but that's just the way that we thought about it and the arguments I tried to make.
Now, Brian, you need to talk about the 8 companies that didn't turn out to be successful.
Well, there's one that's
talk about the home runs.
There's one that's been in the news lately. There's a company called NS8, which the FBI is investigating for fraud. The only reason we passed on that is because there was something else in our portfolio that looked very similar. Phew.
That's also a home run. If you got to do it, right? So.
Fair. Great. I think, are there, in thinking about, okay, so this, we talked a lot about the big ideas in automation and how to make it happen, but do you think there's any big pain points in the industry today that stick out to you as ripe opportunities for disruption? Kind of, we talked a little bit about networks and that sort, but any other parts of the industry that really stick out to you as, hey, this is something that that's going to change for backcasting in 20 years, something like that?
I would say instantaneous kind of communication between parties still seems to be something that's just like lying out there for everybody to tackle. Partly it's because communication networks you don't really execute on communication networks. So it's hard to be you need like one party to be the initial kind of buyer investor, and then you need to drag everybody else onto it. So it almost needs to be embedded within something that you execute or procure on or pay on. But it just seems absurd that like there's still networks of logistics networks that run on WhatsApp and on, or you need to buy another layer of software that prioritizes all the 28 other communication mechanisms that you use between internally and between all your parties. So it feels like there needs to be some big shakeout to kind of create whatever the next version of email is, that's much more in line with how everybody thinks and talks to each other. But again, it's way easier to report on this than to actually build it. So
I have one opinion, and I'm not sure how soon or late it'll happen, but I think that logistics networks and supply chains will start to become more like software-defined networks. And what I mean by that is that the use of data and automation changes. So for example, we've had computers for a long time, but Burger King, they use computers to query a database to ask, how many hamburgers did I sell today? Or how many hamburgers did I sell at this restaurant today, or in all of Chicago today? But operationalizing your data is different from that. So operationalizing your data means that it flows through the product. So the people who started operationalizing data were the people, it started in the sharing economy because people started to realize that the internet lets you locate an unused resource for free. And, whether that's a textbook that you could rent, or somebody's house that you can stay in when they're not there, or an unused seat in a car that you can ride in if there's a driver. And so at the limit, I believe that trucks have space, and any unused space in a truck at all times will be able to broadcast its availability. And when you combine that with software-defined networks and prediction machines, it'll radically transform the capacity utilization of our trucking system and the agility and anti-fragility of these networks. And so what people will start to realize is that automation is no longer used just to do more of the same thing you did, but just faster, more efficiently. Instead, you'll reimagine what it would look like for it to be a software-defined network where instantaneously you can connect and optimize to any unused capacity on any truck at any time, or you can arbitrage what that space will be worth someday and buy it on a forward contract.
Yep.
So like at the limit, it makes a market for unused space at all times where there's a future market, a presence market.
Yep.
And to me, that will just happen, right? It's like, and it'll be facilitated by the fact that the ability to locate that unused space in real time creates the opportunity for liquidity that didn't exist before.
Yep.
That's great. So we're thinking about, you know, the vision of what's to come. If we take a look then instead today, if we look around in the industry, what are some areas you think we take for granted today that just we're not going to recognize in 10, 15 years? They're just going to be upended. I know, you know, Eric, you gave the example of email and existing communications, but are there any other areas of the industry, if we take a look around, that we think, well, that's probably going to be unrecognizable in one way or another?
Well, let me just jump in again. Just in the last week, we've seen a couple brokers sort of, I would say, provide something that's on the spectrum of what Leaf does, right? Talking in very concrete terms about ripping up sort of the annual bid process as it exists. So I think we're probably, and you guys were part of this, if not one of the instigators of this. I think we're probably going to look back at 10 years from now and say that annual bid process is a small portion of what it is now, and it doesn't make sense when you talk about the environment Mike just talked about. When you talk about, you know, just in exponentially more access to data that you can understand in a quicker fashion, like why would you make year-long commitments that aren't really being honored either way anyway? So I would suspect that would be one thing that would be looked at as quite obsolete in 10 years.
Great. Yeah. I mean, certainly we have a perspective on that here.
I knew it was pretty a receptive crowd to that type of opinion. So, but I wouldn't have said it if we didn't see like other players in the market kind of voicing those same types of.
Sure. Well, and 2020 has had an impact, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Anything else to add from anyone else on that?
Maybe I'll. So when I was getting ready for this, initially I thought, do I have anything intelligent to say that would be of any value? And I did some thinking about, you know, some of the writing I've done, and I realized in April I wrote a column about, someone asked me, because there's still a lot of doubts about our investment thesis at REFASHIOND, which is that if you start now and think about what the future of the world, as best we can tell, looks like, then you should be investing in supply chain technology, because all the big problems we have to solve are related to supply chains. And so, you know, coming back to flog the backcasting horse, thinking back to now, where like we should build a fund to do just that. And you know, so people were, well, Brian, with the pandemic, et cetera, will all these supply chain startups that you're excited about survive? And you know, initially it's like, we've got you now. Those supply chain startups that you're so excited about are not going to make it. I'm like, no, they actually are going to thrive, right? Some of them definitely won't make it, but I think as a whole, they're going to thrive. And the reason is that basically what supply chain startups are doing is helping their enterprise customers become more economically productive, right? They're squeezing costs out of your operations and squeezing costs out of your supply chain network. And it didn't really make, you know, it's a very fuzzy concept until, you know, during one of the lessons I was teaching at NYU, the lesson on productivity, the authors had very helpfully provided a table it's a table of supply chain costs in various industries as a percentage of sales on average, right? So it turns out that in transportation, supply chain costs as a percentage of sales is 62%. 62% of a transportation company's sales are spent dealing with costs in the supply chain network. The range for the industries that they talked about in the chapter went from 30% for restaurants up to 79% for petroleum, for gas and for oil and gas. And so if you think about that, this is, again, you're spending 79% of your revenues meeting costs in your supply chain. So if a startup company came to you and said, I could reduce that ratio from 79% to 75% or to 70%, right? What's the value? What does that mean for that company? And I think when it's you know, if you think about the slides that Anshu went through at the beginning, that's precisely what Leaf is doing for its customers, right? You're creating savings for your members that might not have been possible without Leaf, and it's not even might not have been possible. We have the example right there. What happens when you're using Leaf, and what happens when you're not using Leaf in the same company. And now I can't remember if that is directly tied into the comment that Eric and Mike just made, but I thought I had to say that.
Just one other thing, Greer, that I think is interesting in all this is I believe that the supply chain in most corporations used to be sort of thought of by the CEO as almost like the back of the restaurant, right? It's like, it's the stuff you had to do and you had to do it well, but it wasn't the thing that the CEO was necessarily excited about every night.
Yep.
But I think with one of the other things that is going to happen with COVID-19 is a recognition that relocalizing our supply chains and treating our supply chains as if they are not the back of the restaurant, but they're like at the very center of how we do business and compete, not just company by company, but as an economy, is going to be important. And so I think that the world is now more receptive to ideas among executives within companies of, hey, let's play offense with our supply chain, than it would have even been. You know, one type of inflection we didn't really talk about so far is belief inflections. And so like, now more people believe that telemedicine makes sense on the doctor and the patient side. Yes. And I believe that one of the big belief inflections in the next 5 years will be supply chain is not something you just have to do. It's a strategic imperative. It's something that you therefore want to play technology offense with respect to, rather than just doing a job that's good enough. And I think that, you know, trucking is like one of the most vital parts of our supply chain, and it's only natural that it will become increasingly digital in the next few years. If it wasn't going to happen already, I think it'll be accelerated now.
I'll just build on what Mike said very quickly. On the very first day of class, the observation I made to the students, and I know they didn't believe me, was that without supply chain and operations, you don't have a company. Without supply chain and operations, supply chain and operations is how you deliver on your promise to your customers. If you don't have supply chain and operations, there's nothing to market, right? So why are people excited about marketing if they aren't excited about supply chain and operations? And without supply chain and operations, no one owes you anything and you don't owe anyone anything. So there's no accounting or finance. But to Mike's point about belief systems and executives are realizing that they need to pay much more attention to supply chain, I think that's exactly right.
It's a great point, definitely.
So we're moving into the Q&A session. You know, we just have a few minutes left, so we might not get to all the questions from the audience, but did want to turn it over to a few that have come in. So keep them coming. If we don't get a chance to get to them all in the next 14 minutes, we'll answer them in the roundup we send out later this week. So the first one here, I'm going to read this first question. Mike talked about breakthrough automation in the context of logistic network resilience, especially in times like now during the pandemic. In the present time, things like the current driver shortage, lack of connectivity in the market, increasing insurance rates, and low carrier margins results in a lot of volatility, making for an extremely fragile market. What, in your opinion, do you think is needed to happen to drive more towards an order of magnitude in resilience and breakthrough? I think that's directed at Mike, but if anybody else wants to
well, I'll give it a try.
Yeah.
And I should be very careful here, tread lightly, right? Because I'm not a trucking, logistics, transportation expert, right? And so I'm not gonna advertise that I am, because that would be false advertising. But here's my general belief: is that you have generally speaking in an ecosystem, to Brian's term, you have three types of organisms. You have organisms that are fragile and brittle. So, imagine you're shipping glass in a box. That's fragile. And then you have something that's resilient, like say granite. If you put granite in a box and ship it by FedEx, it's probably going to end up okay on the other side. And then you have things that are anti-fragile. It's like a hydra. You cut one head off, it grows two back. Yeah. And to me, what software-defined networks enable is anti-fragility, in the sense that the more uncertainty you throw at it, the more robust it becomes. And so when something can broadcast the availability of the supply of something for free accurately, and simultaneously broadcast the demand for something accurately for free, algorithms can form an ad hoc connection in real time between the supply side and the demand side, and then clear the market for that transaction. Yep. And so, the internet itself was designed for a world where there's a nuclear war, and can the network still survive, with packet switching and kind of an anti-fragile network architecture. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at. And so in future pandemics, hopefully we won't have any, but if we do, or future change events, or future whiplash of any kind, which is only accelerating year after year, what we want is these anti-fragile networks that can say, bring it on. Like my first principles architecture is so robust that that it actually relishes uncertainty, and it relishes chaotic dynamic conditions around me. Whereas like tops-down systems that require that you hire more and more people and have more and more process and more manually defined, and kind of more and more 20th century kind of centralized approaches, I think tend to be more fragile. They tend to look at the world as if it's a machine rather than the real world, which is a dynamic ecosystem force of nature, right? And that requires resilience rather than sort of brittle, but sort of, dedicated use case designs. I hope that made sense as an answer.
Yeah, I'll add to that just a little bit. It's I think I've written maybe 2 articles that sort of touch on that. And they are exploring this idea that the world is becoming more volatile, more uncertain, more complex, and more ambiguous. And in a world that is becoming more VUCA, to use the acronym, what sorts of supply chain do you want to be relying on? The analogy I like to use is the starfish and the spider. So a spider, you cut off a spider's head, and it's dead, right? So uncertainty somehow cuts off the head of your supply chain, right? Your core supply chain infrastructure, and your company is screwed. a starfish, you cut a starfish into two pieces, and each piece becomes a new starfish. and I think that's the idea of anti fragility that Mike was talking about, right? That when your supply chain or your operations encounter a shock to the system, that they recover and are in a much better state than they were before that shock.
I'll let me just give some thoughts too. I think of this, I was rereading the question in the Q&A, and I sort of think it boils down a little bit to neutrality versus non-neutrality. Mm-hmm. And what I say is, by that I mean, are you aligning? So I think traditionally shippers have gravitated towards service providers that they feel are accountable because they have to serve them and will serve them in the best way. What's become available over the last 2 decades is neutral platforms that require a little bit more work and nuance than a pure kind of just 3PL relationship. But what that enables you to do is to the person who asked the question, it enables you to access all of the networks potentially, yes, instead of just one of the networks or a portion of the network. So if I rent a hotel room in New York, I know instinctively that there are a million great restaurants to go, or there were a million great restaurants to go to, but I don't instinctively know which one is right around the block or which one has a reservation for me. If I have a good friend who's that neutral network in that city who knows, oh, you don't go to that restaurant on Wednesday, you go to this restaurant, because he's plugged into all of those. I have an innate advantage over someone who's just landing and going to the restaurant that's around the corner from them because they don't know anymore beyond that. So I think I'm not going to solely advocate for, kind of neutral platforms, but to me, it seems like the ability to build that resistance to the volatility that Brian and Mike talked about is having access to as many different networks as possible. And you only get that through a truly neutral platform.
Just one more thing, Greer, because this is something I'm really obsessing about laytly. But to the question about what will we see in the future that we don't necessarily see now, and tying to the comments that Mike and Eric just made, I think and this is something I'm starting to explore, just thinking about, but I think we're going to move into a world where we have many more tried and true supply chain platforms and supply chain ecosystems for exactly the reasons that both Mike and Eric just talked about.
Great, that was really helpful. Probably have time for one more question before we break. This one, okay, innovation teams for logistics should be modeled just like product research and innovation teams in their industry. Those teams understand long gestation periods. I guess the question is then, does the type of change we're talking about require long gestation periods and require those types of research and innovation teams? Or does this change, can it take place in shorter time periods? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
Okay, next one. No.
Both.
I agree.
Both. It depends on the problem and depends on the range of solutions out there. But no, it's a great question, actually.
Yeah. I believe that innovation teams they're basically R&D teams, right? They're basically R&D teams in a respect, and they should function as such.
Just one thought on innovation teams. And we've applied this at startups, but I think it's a fairly portable thought process. I like to say that new futures have 3 key players apart from the change maker themselves. They have practitioners, seers, and then believers. And the seers have a tendency to look at the future in very interesting tops down, they see the forest, not the trees kind of ways. And so they're good at questioning assumptions about the present. The problem with seers, though, is quite often they're not grounded enough. Quite often they don't have enough
Yeah.
skin in the game, and so they're not encumbered by the practical realities of making. They like to lit traffic in the world of ideas, and that kind of stuff. Practitioners, on the other hand, sometimes get frustrated by, they're like, look, I'm accountable for a number this quarter. Why do you want me to dream up all this wacky nonsense about the future? And so, like, if you're going to make change, part of your job is to resolve the impedance mismatch between the seers and the practitioners. And so therefore, if you have an innovation team, you want to have both types of sensibilities on the team. You don't want it to just be 100% practical people, but you don't want it to be 100% wacky futurists who aren't grounded at all. And it's like, because what you find is that pragmatists on their own won't visualize a new future, and seers on their own won't do the work to bring their futures back to the present. That's the change maker's job. But if you don't have a team with the balance of those types of people, your ideas about what needs to happen will tend to be biased. And then to kind of get more directly back to the question, I look at futures can be farther out into the future, or they can be more crazy, right? So you could have, like, some futures are preposterous at first, right? Like Elon Musk says, I'm going to start a company that blasts rockets into outer space. A lot of people, even if he told you that, they'd say, hey, I think you're smoking something, right? I just don't, thanks for trying to reveal that. I don't believe you. And so I like to say, on some level, a different future is like a bet. Any leader has a risk profile, and any leader has skills that naturally align with certain different types of projects and not with others. And any team, the same is true. And so to me, like, the different future that you're driving people to is your own personal bet about what you think you can pay off and lead people to. And so, there's two dimensions to that. How far out in the future is it? And how different from the present is it? And it's like, it's up to you to decide as a leader where your sensibilities, right? If you're Elon Musk, you say, I'm going to do really wacky futures way out into the future. And if you're, somebody who's going to make something different, but not totally crazy, you might be less out into the future and less novel and surprising.
Great. I think that's a good note to end on too, on how we think about what are some of the practical ways companies can, think about implementing some breakthrough automation. And really thank you all for your time. Appreciate it. Again, if we didn't get to anyone's questions, feel free to follow up with us. We will follow up with our roundup at the end of the week and provide, the recording of this and answer any unanswered questions. But thank you all for your time. Appreciate it. It's a great discussion, and thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.